So welcome back. I think it's time to start for the last session. My name is Horst Hahn. I'm a physicist and computer scientist from Bremen, northern Germany. And I welcome you to the Ethics in Diagnostic AI session. It's my great pleasure to welcome the panel members. First of all, Saskia Nagel, who is a professor of applied ethics in Aachen. And she worked at the interface of cognitive science and philosophy and medicine. And she will give us a short impulse statement just in a minute. And thereafter, we will have an open discussion, so where all your questions can be answered. So if I think about ethics in AI, I think it's also about interdisciplinarity. And so I'm really happy that we have a number of disciplines here on the panel. There's Carolina Welby. She's a professor of microscopy science, and she has quite a number of expertises. She covers molecular biotechnology, image processing, but also genetics and pathology. And we have two radiologists on the board, Nandita de Souza from the Royal Marsden and the Institute of Cancer Research, and Ritze Mann, who you all know, certainly, who are our general chair and one of the leading experts in breast imaging. So when I say multidisciplinarity, I feel that's where the field is going. We will have more and more data integration. And we have seen over the last talks how challenging it is to develop a system, how to combine data from multiple disciplines, but also across sites and countries, and then to validate a method later. And what's even more challenging in many cases is to make a validated system accessible to routine care. And then when we have a system, we can ask ourselves, what does it change? What does it change to our profession? And yeah, this is, I think, one of those core questions. Or what are the situations where you as professional medical doctors feel are ethically challenging? And so with that, I would like to hand over the word to Saskia Nagel to give us her impulse statement, and then come back to the panel for the discussion. Saskia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Horst. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to kick off such an interesting panel. And actually, I had the pleasure to listen in silently to some of the talks, which are, of course, quite far away from what an ethicist usually listens to. But I was happy to, like, at several points during the workshop, notice topics that are interesting for an ethics discussion, for sure. And just in the last talk, that was very clear with the future AI, thinking about reliability, the responsibility for errors, and so on. So I think it's also a nice place to have an ethics panel at the end of this conference. So let me start just with a very quick overview, and then I want to zoom in on three topics that I would like to focus on for this really short input. So ethics regarding AI in medicine and in oncology in particular comes in with a wide range of questions, ranging from pretty practical questions like functionality, usability, effectiveness, also security, usefulness. It's also an ethical question, like asking, do we really need this application in this context? Is it useful and helpful for us, or do we just want it because we have it? It's a very often overseen question, but one that I would always like to ask. Privacy, consent, data security. There's no ethics talk without cost-benefit ratio. So is it worthwhile doing this, or are the costs too high? Costs on different levels, of course. But then also questions of trust. And I will end my talk with a trust question. But what I would like to focus on are the three challenges involved. First, the challenge to autonomy, because that's a challenge that I hear quite often, especially in the medical field, that people fear that their autonomy is at risk when they integrate AI into their routines. Second, the challenge of epistemic accessibility. This is about us not being fully able to understand what the system, the artificial system, is offering us. And then finally, the challenge of moral responsibility attribution. And that's, I think, also a challenge that is very intuitive, namely asking who's responsible when there is an AI involved in the decision-making process. And so I argue all of those challenges are ultimately about the integrity of the doctor-patient relationship that, of course, at least today, 2021, we value and want to keep as a close relationship, and we do not happily open it to a doctor-patient AI relationship. So at the moment, we really, at least from a moral perspective, would like to keep the human-human relationship. And for those in particular, those three challenges are important. And I will walk rather quickly through those, and I open the discussion with that, with this short talk. So I'm happy to have all kinds of questions on what I'm introducing here. So first, the challenge to autonomy. So is it really us being puppets on a string, like in the Cornell art piece? And I would argue, no, not at all. But let's first look at what people are worried about. So first, the very idea of many applications that we have in medical AI has a beneficial purpose in mind, of course. So the idea is that users, practitioners, users in a broad sense can offload or delegate those forms of cognitive labor that AI can do better, thereby freeing up time and cognitive resources for what humans can do better. So that's the very positive view on how we can use and see AI. And I think that's we should keep this in mind. That's the very idea of why we want those systems in medical practice. What are the challenges now? So when we talk about the challenge to autonomy, the first challenge or the first worry that people have is that we risk de-skilling and dependency. So first, de-skilling, basically losing or atrophying our abilities that we usually, I'm not medical personnel, but that probably all of you have, abilities that you learned and have, that you are de-skilled by using AI, or maybe worse, that you're becoming dependent on the AI, not being able to do what you used to be able to do without the AI beforehand. And that is de-skilling and dependency are both dangers to your autonomy, because autonomy means you're pretty much free and able to decide fully by yourself. And the second bit that is a challenge to autonomy is the risk of what has been called quite a bit in the literature in the past years, a so-called new paternalism. So everyone knows what the old paternalism was, and we escaped that in medicine in the past decades. And now people worry that there's a new paternalism where the AI knows better than what we know. And that's of course a worry that one can understand. But what I would like to put as an answer to those worries is basically another understanding of artificial systems, namely understanding current and probably also future artificial systems basically as tools that we can use for autonomy support. Going back to the benefit that I quickly sketched on the last slide, what I would like to suggest is that we can use AI or any kind of technological means for decision support in particular to support us in realizing our autonomy. And that basically is about offloading, freeing resources, but doing all of this, and that's important for me as an ethicist, in alignment with our values, needs, and desires. And this is, of course, both relevant for the physician, but also for the patient to be able to stay autonomous also in their usage of artificial intelligence systems, staying in alignment with their values, needs, and desires. And that's a very basic but important idea how to understand our using of AI, which comes with a second bit, namely, if we understand AI as autonomy support, it can help us to keep or even gain new control where we perceive this as necessary. So there are situations where physicians say, here it's really necessary that I am under control. So I take control and I keep the control. And this shouldn't be undermined by artificial intelligence solutions. So control, and we will come to control in the third challenge as well, is really like at the current stage of where we have AI, it's really important that control stays in the human hand. At least for now, I would say. So just to illustrate the idea of autonomy support a little bit, we know autonomy support on a personal, social level. Like we have autonomy support by peers, by communities, by the healthcare system, by ethics boards, if it comes to normative questions. And we can have the analogy with technological autonomy support, namely by well-designed decision aids, assistive systems, but also by morally permissible nudging or persuasive technologies, which we also have in the medical context. How I would like to end this challenge is saying that we need to understand, if we are buying into this autonomy support idea, understanding which kind of support is adequate for which purposes, for which practitioner. So it's a very context sensitive question because not everyone in each situation needs the same. Quickly jumping to the next challenge of epistemic accessibility. It's basically referring to how readily and how completely knowledge about something is available to us. And that probably rings the bell of black or gray boxes. I prefer to talk about gray boxes, not black boxes, because I think it is actually often not black boxes. But the idea is that epistemic access is hindered by the opacity that comes by automating decision making. So it's difficult for us, especially for people who are not very well trained in AI, to understand what systems do, how they work, and how they come to a specific outcome. Opacity now, why is that a key challenge? It's of really like major ethical importance, because if a system is opaque, it's easy for it to be manipulative. It opens what we call responsibility gaps, and I will talk about that in the third challenge. And obviously, it also undermines trust. If we do not understand the system, it's really hard to trust it. In particular, if we notice that we do not understand it. There are also systems where we think we understand it, then we still trust it. As soon as we notice we don't understand it, trust is undermined. So how to approach that? And sorry that this is a bit packed slide, but it's mostly about the three terms: transparency, explainability, and interpretability. And I think that here on this for this audience, everyone heard of those solutions already. That's the typical solutions in AI that people, also the computer scientists and data scientists, try to deal with opacity. First, transparency. Basically, the idea is to make information maximally available. And I think this really comes with a lot of problems, because making information available does not mean that people understand what they are presented with. So I'm really not a fan of transparency, as you can hear. Second approach is explainability. That's widely used also in the whole community of explainable AI. This is basically providing a user with a usable explanation. And here I would like to ask whether we always need these explanations and whether they are always desirable. And that's something that is also context dependent, so I argue. And the third and most ambitious approach is interpretability, where it's really about understanding cause and effect of a specific system without giving further explanation. So really making obvious cause and effect. And this is oftentimes not really possible. What I would ask as an ethicist is, we have all those systems, all these answers available, but what we would really need to find out to have morally permissible systems is understanding when do we need what? Which communication is actually beneficial in which medical context? And then following up on a discussion point from the last talk, do we expect the same or more from an artificial system? So do we have what a colleague of mine called double standards? We seem to ask quite a lot from an artificial system to explain itself, what we are not asking from our colleagues physicians. So, and that's an interesting observation and something that I think is important to get clarity about. What do we actually need and want, and why, in which context? And that's already closing the second challenge and leads me to the third challenge, namely the challenge of moral responsibility attribution. And I explicitly say it's not only the challenge of moral responsibility, but of moral responsibility attribution, because what is important here is that we are attributing responsibility. Responsibility is not out there in the world, but it is something that in our social interaction, we take and give. So it's really about attribution. And that's going to be important because the big question is, what do we do when we have an AI in the system? So the discussion here is, and that's just putting it in like super short, the discussion here is talking a lot about the so-called responsibility gap. And what is this gap? It's basically a gap in tracking responsibility. At some point in time, when we have an artificial system involved in a decision-making process, we still have at the end of the decision-making process, we have legitimate demand for responsibility attribution. So patient or family members or other physicians can ask, now who's responsible for that outcome? But when we have AI in the system, we do not have a legitimate target to bear responsibility, because artificial systems in our world today are not suitable bearers of moral responsibility. They're just not moral agents, and we don't attribute responsibility to them. So then the key question is how to handle situations when the artificial system decision leads to harm. And that's, I think, a very, very important and probably also like very important question, and probably also a question that pops up in practice quite soon once you involve an AI decision-making system. So what's the possible answers to this challenge? There are basically three ways trying to answer them, and I already say I don't think any of them holds. So it's not very satisfying, but we'll see. So first is, let's try to find a way and track and then distribute responsibilities proportional to the contribution to the harm. So meaning looking at basically a decision-making trace and saying who was responsible, how much, at which point in time, which is often impossible in many cases, because that would also like trace back, for example, to the software engineers who developed the AI. And another problem is, next to it being like epistemically impossible, is that responsibility really dissolves at its spread too thin. So if you really want to include everyone in this tracing, probably nothing is left for each of the members in the chain, and that's unsatisfying. Second, and that's actually seriously discussed, to my surprise, in the literature on responsibility attribution, is revising our practices and saying that there is no demand for responsibility once we have AI in the loop. I think this is like at least 2021. This is really counterintuitive, and we need to satisfy our psychological need to be able to attribute responsibilities. So I think we are not in a position to say we are basically deleting our desire for responsibility attribution altogether. In particular, in the field of medicine, I cannot even imagine how that would look like. Like, how do you want to tell a patient or kins that there's just no way to ask for responsibility. I cannot see that this would work. Next to that, of course, there's a well-founded worry that this might incentivize recklessness and negligence, because if there's no responsibility afterwards, there's also no one to blame, of course. So that's also not very satisfying. And the last suggestion is recognizing the possibility for collective responsibility. And this is a rather new development in, ethics and action theory, thinking about collectives as collectives as being able to hold responsibility. This is in itself hotly contested, but it works for institutions, for example. So we do hold Volkswagen responsible for what is happening, or we hold Huawei responsible, or we can hold responsible a hospital if something is not going well. So this, as I said, is all not very satisfying, but that's the debate on responsibility at the moment. I think for the time being, we should stay with a very traditional and conservative approach, saying for now, humans just must take responsibility. And I'm like, that sounds super, super naive and easy, but at the moment, I think this is the only reasonable answer to the responsibility gap, saying humans must take responsibility for what they are doing and basically do as they did until before we had AI, being responsible and accepting that this is their position. This is and coming to an end with that. This is what's widely discussed as the solution pretty much to everything: all purpose good, trust, and everything is going to be all right. And I'm once again skeptical about this seemingly nice and easy solution. Probably you all heard the terminology around trustworthy AI. This is what the EU puts as their main claim, that that the EU is developing trustworthy AI, and with that we are so much better than everyone else in the world. And I would challenge this, and I do challenge this terminology, and think that what we actually mean here is reliable AI. And I like that in the last talk that was already a piece in the future AI. The reliability was a bit in the acronym. And I'm challenging trustworthy AI just because I don't think that humans trust artificial systems. We trust people behind the artificial system. We do not trust the system. But I'm happy also to be challenged with that. Key challenge or key questions here again is, how can we understand and improve all directions of trust in the patient-physician AI triad? If we are going to trusting AI, we need to integrate AI into this relationship. And then going back to the second challenge, who do we trust when decisions cannot be explained? And that's a big question. That's also basically a psychological question next to the ethical question. And yeah, with that, I'd like to end. I think what we need to do is basically understanding what makes a good relation in medical context, and in medical context, including AI. And then that's my plea that I'm promoting everywhere where I can. Let's try to use artificial system in medicine as a help and as a helping companion to strengthen the relationships that we have in medical context. And well, let's use AI basically as a tool to allow us to have better relationships. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and right away close the screen sharing as I was told. And now I'm very happy to discuss.
Thank you, Saskia. Thank you so much for many valuable inputs. I directly want to switch over to the discussion. Maybe jump in on the autonomy topic. You talked about autonomy, about the accessibility, understanding, and the responsibility, but let me talk about autonomy and maybe give it over to Ritze first. So Ritze, imagine a system that just at every error you do just makes a loud beep, and just to feel like you're not allowed to do errors anymore because the system just knows it always better or so. So what would that do to you? Would it be helpful?
In a situation like that, it would drive me crazy, I guess. But I don't think it will ever work that way. If there's a task that system is definitely better in than I am, I think I'll hand over, because there are many other places where I could actually spend my time better. And I think that is we don't talk a lot about that, but I do think that there are some fields in particularly radiology, but likely also pathology from what I've seen, considering the fantastic RC curves that are being presented, where these computers basically are going to outperform physicians. Is that an issue? No, but it will mean that our way of working and the way we handle our patient contact actually changes. For example, screening mammography, the thing I'm mostly or most comfortable with, is a thing that I don't really see myself doing in 10 years from now, provided that we still stay with mammography. Right? I really think that there are computers now that are as good as I am. There will be computers in the future that are definitely, well, they at least don't require a cup of coffee once every hour or so. And I do. There's a moment that I'm really not at my sharpest, and you won't have that kind of issues. However, that would basically make me more doctor, because it will bring me to the patient and then discussing the outcomes of the AI with the patient.
That's the ideal scenario. Thank you. Nandita, do you want to comment? Because it's not always true what the AI gives. If on average you would say it knows the answer better, it's not right always, and it gets more complicated. If we do a multidisciplinary integration and see patterns in all those integrated data, it's less and less for us possible to trace back the sources of this AI proposal.
Yes, but for instance, Marie-Pierre Rivel showed yesterday some very powerful data on chest X-ray diagnosis, where she showed how the AI got it better over and above the radiologist time and time again, just for chest X-rays. So if an algorithm was going to perform like that, I wouldn't want to be the one making errors on the chest X-ray. I would rather let the algorithm flag up the abnormalities and then make a value judgment on it. Or if it was better than me, then that's fine, because it's beyond human visual perception what it's picking up. So this is great. And like Ritze said, to move on and do things where I can do better. And it's just to talk about the de-skilling thing that Saskia talked about. You know, before we had ultrasound, before we had ECGs, before we had stress tests, cardiologists used to examine patients and listen to their hearts and make a physician judgment on how they were going to treat that patient. Now, if you go and see a cardiologist, before you've even hit their door, they've ordered the echo, the ECG, the stress test and everything. They just read the test and tell you the answer. This is what decision we're going to make. So we're just going to be using AI as a tool in the same way that all these imaging and other tools have come along. They are now indispensable. Nobody would think about managing without an ultrasound for or an echo for a cardiology practice. Why would we think about managing without AI if it can do so well?
Yeah, thank you. So I share that view quite a lot. It's nothing else than another biomarker tool or so. Carolina, you wanted to comment, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I'm actually at the Department of Information Technology, and it's really the algorithm that's my sort of background. And I sometimes think of AI systems in image analysis as a spell check. So if I write a text and I'm in a hurry, I make spelling mistakes, and then they're highlighted in red. And sometimes there's a name that the computer has never seen before, and that's highlighted in red, but I know I spell it right. So I make a decision that that's the way it should be. And then there are some names or some words that actually spelled wrong. And so I'm always the one making the decision, and the system helps me work faster. But then when we come to the de-skilling, maybe the system makes me a bit more sloppy at spelling, and maybe I forget how to spell words. But on the other hand, maybe I'm more brave to use words that I'm not so used to, and I just, you know, try some kind of spelling, and then I can actually also learn from the system. And when I think of these like decision making, I don't think you have to exactly understand what the AI system does, but if it can just point you to where in the image the pixels were that led to the decision, or Nandita mentioned these like multi-parameter systems where you input lots of different types of data. If you can just highlight that the decision was primarily based on these factors out of whatever was input, then I don't need to know exactly how the decision was made, but then if I'm doubting it, I know which 3 factors to take a closer look at to make my decision, rather than me looking at each of the input parameters that that were needed for the final decision. So kind of think of it more as a guide for the decision making, for me to be faster and as Richard said, then spend more time on what is really where the human has the great capacity in the connection with the patient, or looking at the really rare cases, and so on.
If you really have more time, Ritza, so I think that's really a positive view on it, to have more time for the patient. But if you would really have more time, wouldn't you see a risk for our healthcare system to just optimize further and take away the time to give you another few patients more per hour or per day?
That would likely happen, right? I mean, if you look at the current Dutch healthcare system, and I guess in Germany it's sort of similar, everyone screams every year louder that it becomes unaffordable. We can do so much, and we need so many people to actually do it, that we need to find ways to actually make things cheaper, which means basically doing the same stuff with less people, which implies that, well, I will have some free time on my hands when you are an early adopter. But when you are at the end of the line, there is no way that you can avoid adopting it, because the work is impossible to do without taking it on. I guess that if you were always riding a horse and then suddenly everyone was in a car, and at a certain point you realize that you are always 2 hours late at work because you didn't have a car, it will be something like that. Somehow you need to adapt, because otherwise you fall out of the system, and that's maybe painful, and I think people will get hurt by it, but it's also sort of reality. It happens all the time.
Nandita.
I think this fear of we're going to be out of work because the AI is going to do it all is so totally false. You know, there is so much to do, and medicine is advancing at such a pace that what we as human beings should be doing is being at the forefront, the cutting edge, and pushing the boundaries even further. We can do more and more. Why would we want to do the tasks that can be not totally done by an AI system, but be made much more be facilitated, be made faster, be made more efficient by an AI system? All we're doing is increasing our efficiency and giving us more room for innovation. So I think the autonomy issue is, I don't even know the people who argue for it. I don't think it's real for me.
Saskia.
Yeah, so I keep challenging a bit. So I'm all for what Carolina said, namely understanding AI as a spell check, which basically points you to where you should have a closer look. And I think that's something that is also like, this is where I would say there we even have a moral duty to use those systems. Like if they are so much better and faster and more efficient and everything, then I would say I'm all for this. However, the question is, what are those situations or capacities where you would say, okay, we can then spend time on those? Like Ritz and Nandita both pointed out to the possibility to then basically go to the things and have time for what the AI cannot do. And I wonder what those things are that still need the physician with your training as a physician and your specialty. So I understand rare cases. Clearly, I understand everything that is like specific about human communication. But this is not necessarily everything that you can offer to a patient. So maybe someone can specify what are the tasks that you would say cannot be taken over or helped with by AI.
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm not sure if anybody wants to jump in before me, but I would like to give a partial answer, because I feel no matter how much progress we will have in medical research, and AI research included, clinical decision support, whatever it could be, whatever we do, we will have a medicine that is further evolving into more and more complexity and detail. And the technology will help us to manage this complexity somehow with our human limitation. And so in the end, the human role is to be, well, the manager of the remaining uncertainty. So because there's always options. Sometimes it's more clear, like 100%, maybe never 100, but kind of. And sometimes really you feel like, wow, that's a difficult case. And just this barrier, this frontier of knowledge will further evolve, but the human role is exactly there in my view. And so the question is, how can we maintain the ability to take this human role, the human patient responsibility role, despite this huge complexity explosion, if you put it to the next 20 years or so, because the AI will encapsulate quite a lot of knowledge, and it will be super hard for us, to have an overview of all the details. So Nandita says that's not a problem. I feel there's a slight problem in it, because it gets more and more complex in all the different subcases. It's not like a single biomarker anymore that we used to have as a paradigm in the past.
No, I see exactly what you're saying, but also some of what you've said would feed into what we would do next, because the uncertainty is exactly what we as humans or medical doctors should be thinking about. For instance, we have paradigms for treating patients with cancer. If you've got diagnosis, this, tick the box, you go for surgery, then you go for chemotherapy or whatever. But actually, those things are based on prior trials or ways of treating patients that have evolved over decades, but actually the boundaries are always moving. Radiotherapy treatments are getting better, drugs are changing, other techniques are coming online. So we would be then spending our time thinking about the changing paradigms in management based on the diagnostic information we're getting. The diagnostic information is now giving us this huge wealth of information. Why will we stick with the old ways of managing patients? Can we actually move the paradigms forward by changing what we do in our patient management and understanding that? So use the extra information that we have as diagnosticians to improve healthcare. And we can think about that. The AI can't think about that, because that will be different for different patient groups. It's not going to be the same for somebody who's 90 compared to somebody who's 15, who's got a life-threatening disease, for instance. And there are different requirements. For instance, if a young girl has cervical cancer and has to have an operation to remove her womb, that is a huge thing. The AI might just tell you these are the actual characteristics of the tumor. The standard treatment would be surgery, but because you've got all this wealth of information about the tumor now, as a diagnostician, you can think, well, what would be the possibilities of deviating from a standard pathway and design trials to actually make sure that that's safe and efficacious. So, you just use your time differently. You become more thinking rather than just sitting there measuring gray blobs.
Thank you. Yeah, it really is a very constructive view on the whole story. So we have 2 questions from the audience. Carolina, do you want to go before, or shall we first have them?
It was just a really quick comment, and one thing that I think is super important to connect to an AI-made decision is a confidence. There are lots of new AI methods that come with a confidence metric, and I mean, you were taking the example with this really serious surgery, but then if you can have, maybe there are 2 alternative treatments, and then the AI system could say, okay, this is the one that seems best, but then there's also this alternative or this alternative, so that there's like several top directions to walk into where the medical doctor would make the final decision, but sort of have a confidence rather than just say a yes, no, to help guide, and also help to know when to listen to the AI system.
Yeah, I think that also reflects what Saskia has phrased as reliability more than trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is a super high goal in a way, but reliability we can try to quantify, and really we should try to minimize those cases where the AI just says, well, no problem, I know the answer, but in the end it was not trained at all on that case. And so I think this reliability metrics must be validated with an extreme high level of care. And that would be already a huge step for those systems. So if you allow, I would go to the audience questions, and please feel free, everybody in the room, to post new questions. We have 2. I would go to the first one and just put it in the panel here, and somebody might want to answer. How do you think education would need to be reframed for medical students and research students to allow for considerations of the ethical use of AI? Saskia?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and also one that we are also already working on with. So when we're talking about medical ethics curricula, we can't have medical ethics without thinking about AI ethics in medical context, and that includes those challenges that I brought. Even though we might discuss whether those are the most important ones, those are questions that we are discussing in the curricula. We are redeveloping to include AI ethics, which also includes some changes to understanding professional ethics, because also I absolutely agree with the diagnosis that physicians won't be replaced. So these paper headlines, like there won't be any radiologists when we have AI available. I think that's really that's not adequate, but there can well be changes to professional roles, and I'd like to discuss with students what that, like how they can engage as a professional when using AI, and then of course talking quite a bit about responsibility. So it's my favorite topic anyways, but for this topic it is also really important to teach students, medical students, how to think about their responsibility also in using technology. And this can come with questions like understanding reliability metrics, for example, and how to handle them responsibly. So yeah, I think that's a super important thing to do, and I know from different universities that they are changing their medical ethics curricula accordingly.
No other comment at the moment, so I would go to the next question, which was, what risk do you think the use of AI poses to patient privacy and confidentiality, and how this can be managed? Well, I think the question of privacy and confidentiality is often related to the AI developments, and I think we must see a difference between what we need as data to combine for the AI development and validation, so to arrive at a valid tool that can be used later on in clinics, and then when such a tool is used in a clinical scenario, that might be a totally different type of question. Then who wants to give an answer? Carolina.
I can comment on it, and I completely agree that it is tricky with the patient privacy and confidentiality when trying to collect large amounts of data. I mean, in a small country like Sweden, if we want to look at a rare disease and we want to know which imaging system was used to collect the image data, and we might not want to know what sex and what age the patient had. And then just with those few parameters, you might actually be able to pinpoint the patient because the machine all exists in one town and there's so few of these patients. So this level of where to limit the amount of information about the patient is really tricky to keep the patient anonymous when sharing data. But then on the other hand, if you are a patient with a rare disease that might be heritable, or in any case, you don't want others to end up with the same disease as you have, or you want to make the future of medicine better and better at treating your disease, you actually might not care so much about sharing the data. You might already have posted on Facebook that you have this rare disease. I mean, you might just really want the data to be shared to help your children or future patients. So this line between the privacy and sharing, sometimes the laws and legislations are much tougher than what the patient actually wants. So I think it's a tricky balance there.
Yeah, Nadita.
Sorry, I wonder if healthcare systems should have an opt-in and opt-out for data sharing, just like you do for organ transplantation. You can opt in so that if you're in a car crash, they can take your organs or not. You can data sharing. Once you are using that healthcare system, just at the point of entry into the healthcare system, you sign to say whether you are happy to have your data used, because that is really the only way. Otherwise, you would be using data without consent, and in retrospect, that might be a problem if people found out 10 years later that the data was used to create this algorithm. There's all sorts of issues around that. I don't know. It's a question, really, rather than a comment. I don't know what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, in Germany, people are super scary about this patient consent because they feel the broad consent, this general consent. So I donate my data to the research system. Is a question that you should not ask the patient, because they cannot understand what this means. They cannot understand what it could mean that the data is used 20 years later, and they might be very young and still in research. And so the re-identification risk and maybe some other risks that are not discussed even today. So that's a core of the reasons that I understood why people in Germany feel like this broad consent is not something we should really, even ask our patients, because they cannot really grasp the dimension of this saying.
So what's the alternative?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one I see is in this highly distributed scenarios where the data stays in the clinical centers. So it's not shared across centers, not accumulated or even published. So it's really protected. And we have data analysis nodes. And so the pattern recognition and AI shall run locally, and the data should not travel anywhere. And then these pattern knowledges can be accumulated, but not the individual data sets sent across sites or even countries or even published to be accessed by everybody. So that might be a scenario that many people now believe in could be a future, but it's very technically challenging, and maybe also other drawbacks, because the researcher doesn't have a direct grasp on the data. And this is really a new paradigm. Normally, we want the data scientists to have an access to the raw data, and that would not be the case anymore. Ritz, I think, what it do?
Well, there's a couple of things you said that are a bit difficult. I guess that this doesn't solve the issue that Carolina just raised on rare diseases. Even if you have the data of one person in one hospital, that's likely the only person with that disease in that hospital. So that would even make it easier to identify the person in question than make it harder. And honestly, I can only agree with Nandita that if you would do this nicely and ask patients to provide some form of consent the moment they enter the healthcare system, it's more honest than what we are currently doing. Now, actually, what we say is for a small retrospective study, we need to ask for consent of the patients. So we actually start calling them and asking them, can I use your data? But as soon as that exceeds about 100 patients, I'm actually free to use it, because I will claim at the ethical committee that it's impossible to ask for informed consent. And it's good for the society as a whole. And consequently, I can just use the data with all kinds of hurdles. And there's a lot of difficulty in contracting, but that's what's happening. And if you then compare that to a situation where people actually can opt in or opt out beforehand, that's a lot nicer. And compared to what Nandita said on organ transplantation, do you really think that someone who signs in on liver transplantation or spleen donation or kidney donation 20 years from now really knows what he signs? I guess those implications are way bigger than offering your data.
Yeah. Yeah, so we now think about trust centers, so where data can be kind of analyzed, accumulated from multiple sites. And even in our law in Germany, from 2023, people will be able to donate their data into this trust center, and we'll find out what that really means. So it's, I think every country is a bit different, and Europe is kind of a world leader in trying to protect the patient rights. We have a new question. Shall we look at that?
Yeah, I just very quickly wanted to say that probably the little difference between Horst and Ritze is just because the countries handle it differently. So Europe is not doing it all the same, and Germany is pretty strict with that. So the above 100 rule does not we don't have that here. So that's a different.
But still, we have the system of societal interest. So that's part of our data protection law as well. Anyhow, it's complex, and we have to make steps and really discuss in a broader context what could be acceptable. So this question addresses the panic-inducing headlines that you might find in papers, and I think everybody of you have an own idea what that could be. Who wants to answer that? So what role do you think individual researchers and clinicians using AI should have in combating those headlines? Or this should be more the focus of organizations? Somebody wants to answer? For me, it's difficult because I don't see the headline in front of me, and there could be different ones, but I know a few. So is that clear?
Yeah, I think at least like just one quick answer. I think as soon as there's headlines on replacement scenarios, I would always give a counter narrative and say that is a support scenario. So let's understand AI as what it is currently, namely a very good tool, very powerful tool that we can use and should use in a way that it's supportive, in a way that is supportive to what we actually want to achieve in healthcare, and thereby basically changing the narrative from this often present replacement discourses. That's at least the headlines that I have in mind, like replacing the radiologist, the dermatologist after the Estevas paper a few years ago. Like, we don't need the dermatologist. Our health minister even said people should just use the app instead of going to see the dermatologist, which basically enforced the headlines even further. And I think that's just the wrong idea of what AI is and should be. And so I would answer like this, let's have a different narrative of what AI should be.
Nandita.
And just to, I agree with totally with Saskia. The second part of the question, should this be the focus of institutions or organizations? But I think, yes, we all have professional bodies. In the UK, we have the Royal College of Radiologists, the Royal College of Pathologists, and I'm sure there are equivalent professional bodies throughout Europe. Those organizations should actually stamp on that kind of thing and come out with their statements, because I think if it comes from the professional body representing that sector, then it will stamp it out.
Yeah, Carolina.
Well, I again want to go back to this, like the idea of using the AI for decision support. Everybody that is using Spotify or Netflix today is exposed to AI today for suggestions on what maybe the next movie to look at, or the next new release of music to listen to. It's a suggestion that is given by the AI system. And then, I mean, if someone is super scared of the AI, then say, okay, it's a support system, and it doesn't force you to do as the AI system says. But maybe you should look at the suggestion, and maybe the suggestion can actually be valuable and useful because it's based on a lot of data. And also, I think we have to look 100 years back in time when electricity was introduced. Everybody was just super skeptical and said that the electricity would kill us all. And of course there are people that were killed by electricity, but it's not something that we want to live without today.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think there could be different headlines. One you already addressed is this replacement headline, and I fully agree. So it's a tool, and medicine as it is possible in all our countries is still suboptimal from what it could be. And we need to use the tools we have and the people to make medicine as good as we can. But there's other headlines as well, like AI is so fragile, about these often constructed cases where an AI can be fooled by some, for the human eye, very clear negative signal, but the AI is then fully certain this is something else. This was often constructed, but not always. So some of that is real, some of the danger that an AI can be missing a point in a case which is clear to a human. But also about these biases in AI. There's quite a number of headlines about AI is biased to certain populations, which are, of course, induced by the training selection of the data sets. So I feel a lot of that is properly discussed, but maybe not to the point that the general population is aware of these answers. So if you want to have one of those points raised, please feel feel free to bring them up here, also from the auditory. Ritza.
Yeah, a quick comment on it, because I think a lot of what you talk about is actually quality control. And we haven't really discussed that in detail.
Yeah.
As soon as, and also links to the responsibility issue that Saskia brought up in the beginning of this lecture. I guess that if you use AI for some whatever reason, you should have a method to actually state, okay, it is this good. It's allowed to make errors. I think humans make errors, AI could make errors as well. However, it should not make more errors than I expect it to make. The advantage of AI is that actually you can check it, whereas from humans, that's a very difficult thing to do. So we certify someone as a radiologist or ophthalmologist, and with that, he's likely to, making a number of errors, but not as much as the general doctor on the same task. But for AI, we can actually check whether it meets the standards that we imply on independent test data sets that we could organize and manage as a society. And I think that the medical societies and the medical professionals working in this field actually do have some sort of obligation there to make sure that we actually have the possibilities to check quality of AI systems that we use in clinical practice.
Yes, very true. And what's also interesting about this AI discussion, that it's not a single problem always with a single tool answer and then it's fixed for a number of years, but I see it more and more like a moving target because AI needs to evolve as medicine is evolving, and also the validation data sets. So the quality control you're asking for is a dynamically evolving issue. And so we need to see our professional organizations in a role to really, well, ask themselves, how can we make this quality control possible and harder? So that AI tools that are delivered to the clinical world are not, as it has happened in the past quite often, are ready for the real world data and not just have to learn over generations after first release to be accurate enough. So Martin Maciej-Bobowicz asked us, let's imagine us in 20 years. How can we avoid overconfidence in AI tools, especially in specialty trainees, radiology, pathology, and other specialties? So the overconfidence is a bit related to the autonomy, right?
I wonder if I mean, if you can come online and explain, are you meaning about the dependence?
Well, overconfidence could be also the de-skilling. Saskia, you wanted to have an?
Yeah, I think over, like, at least of how I understand overconfidence would mean just relying too much on something that is not as reliable as we think. And
correct, yes.
Yeah, so and I think that that would come with something that we are actually in a project together with Horst. We are working on something that we call for now reality check, and reality check that is basically also available to the public, saying, okay, what is it actually that this AI can offer, and what can't it offer? And like ideally, and I wish the EU would have put something like this in their advice, saying that that every AI should come with something like that, like a reality check. What can I do? What can't I do with this system? And thereby basically being clear about expectations and, well, hopefully avoiding overconfidence. I think it only works on this basically rational level, describing what's possible and what not. But maybe someone else on the panel has a better idea.
Oh, thank you so much, Saskia. I now have also my chairing duties, and so I would like, with the last question of Beatrice, to hand over, Saskia, if you allow me, to final round to Nandita, Carolina, and Ritz. And if you want to be then again in the final round, you have to decide yourself. But we need to wrap up. We are already a bit over time, and we need to close the conference in a very few minutes. So she asks whether we can imagine that AI helps in low resource countries to make access better to good medical practice. So yeah, I think we could continue the discussion for quite a long time, and I really hope we do so, because AI research and development was, at least in my perception, so technology centric in a way over 10, 20 years. And now the last years really have shown an increase of the ethical and social aspect discussion. So I'm very much motivated by that. And I feel we need more research. And yeah, and it's very different from country to country. And I think, yes. So we can
I just answer Beatrice very quickly?
Yeah, please. So I give over to Nandita.
Just that it will make you faster. You use the AI to make you faster, and if you are faster, then you know, you can see more patients. So that will answer the lack of specialists.
Yeah. Do you want to just take a closing word for the final round, Nandita, from your side, and then we just wrap it up?
Oh no, Ritz must have the closing word, but
no, for this ethics session.
For the ethics session, I think that AI, everything we've said, is a tool, and everybody has agreed that this is how we must use it. We must know the uncertainty of the system, the responsibility issues. Saskia outlined very well. Society has to decide whether it's a collective responsibility, or we rescind responsibility, or it's a distributed responsibility. Those are the options. They're still under societal discussion, and clarity will have to come from that. But overall, AI is here to stay, and we must look at it positively, react with it positively, and be aware of its limitations.
Thank you so much. So would you allow me then to close the session, Carolina, Saskia, and I think Ritzer needs to close the conference with me anyhow. So he will have the final words. Carolina, or do you want to say a last word for this session?
Well, just a really quick comment to Beatrice's question there. And I think that if you think of these tools as a decision support, you could also think of it as a teacher. And maybe then in a low resource setting, if you can get some input from a AI tool for decision making, maybe you as a physician can also learn something, and more people can be educated by providing samples and getting suggestions for where the malignant parts are in the image and so on. So it can also increase our knowledge and not only devalue our knowledge.
Yeah, and it can bring even knowledge where there is none, right? I know from a very nice project from Bram that's actually outside of the cancer realm, but it's about tuberculosis imaging in sub-Saharan countries. And basically there is no radiologist there. It's just a technician who can make the thoracic X-ray. And then an AI system that says, okay, you should actually go to a doctor because you might have TB, which has a major impact on health in a setting where before there was none. There was just none. I guess that there's a lot of ethics here, but there's also good things that come from the implementation of AI.
Yeah, I need to jump on that, because that's a misunderstanding of ethics. Ethics is also, and I'm exemplifying that as an answer to the question that was just posed. This is where I would say we even have a duty to, like a moral duty to use the technology there. So ethics is not about red flags everywhere. It's also saying there are situations where we have a duty to use it, because the cost-benefit ratio is so clear that we can do only better by using it. So ethics, just to repeat that, ethics is not about only about the problematic bits, but also about what is beneficial here and where do we have duties, also moral duties, to use it. So it's I have to say that, of course, in my role as ethicist, it's not only about red flags and ethics committees, it's also about where can we do good with something.
That's about ethics, and I fully agree, and thank you. And I would like to just take this up as a closing for this ethics session, because often we talk about, and that's probably really important, about the ethical challenges due to AI, due to the AI development. But AI might also, due to the objectivity it can provide, to help us with some ethical challenges in our medical world. Definitely. And I'm really looking forward to the next ethics and diagnostic AI session somewhere, somewhen with you. Thank you, Saskia, for every contribution from the beginning of this session with your talk, and of course the others. And thank you, Nandita. Thank you, Carolina. And thank you, Ritze, for this session. Thank you all the questions from the auditory. So I close this session, and I'm really moved by this 2 half-day conference, because I feel that the path from research with all the complexity to clinical care is still very far, and we need now to work hard on the last phases to bring the very good and validated research closer to make care better. And so just